In this video, we're going to take a look at reverse engineering a scanned part in Fusion 360. Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video, we're going to talk about reverse engineering a scanned part in Fusion 360. And the scanned part that we have here is this dashboard piece, or rather a center console piece from a more recent Dodge Charger. Now, there are a couple interesting things that we do want to talk about. We're not going to fully reverse engineer this, and I'm not going to be providing the scan. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to take a look at some high-level techniques and ways in which we can replicate this geometry. And again, we're not going to go completely through everything because I'm not providing the scan data, so we're going to try to keep it as short as possible and just hit some of the highlights. The first thing I think is important for us to note is that when we're talking about scan data, now specifically what we're talking about here is we're talking about the scan of this dashboard component. Now when we're talking about this, we have to think about the resolution of the scan itself. And this is a problem that we see more commonly these days because of companies like Revo, which makes, $200 to $1,000 scanning kits that you can get. Other companies out there like Connect, which gives you a scanner software that you can use with the Xbox Connect. And again, there are plenty of others on the market that are really targeted at the hobbyist. There are also photogrammetry programs where you can take a bunch of pictures of something and try to recreate it. But the problem that we're going to run into with something like this is, and if I hide the edges, you can see that this thing has a lot of wrinkles in it. So when we take a look at something like this, these wrinkles are a product of the resolution of the scanner itself, as well as things like shadows. So when we get these bulges up near corners, it's because of the shadows in the corners. It really makes problems for scanners. You can see on this one that there's actually a dimple there. And this is pretty much, I can guarantee that this is the casting of the shadow from this portion of the object. So lighting, surface prep, all of these things are extremely important with high-end scanners, but they're also extremely important with these more consumer-grade hobbyist type scanners. But that doesn't mean that we can't get something out of this data. Now, again, it's not ideal because we are seeing a lot of irregularities in areas where it should be relatively smooth. So again, in this video, we're not going to be going completely through the process, but I want to highlight a couple of different workflows that you can use. The first thing here is to get the scan in, we use the Insert Mesh option in Fusion 360. We've done that before, we've talked about it, and we've reverse engineered a BMW motor mount. So I'm not going to go through that process, but what I do want to do is I want to talk a little bit about ways in which we can use forms and ways in which we can use surfacing and mesh sketches. First, we also need to realize that the bracket that we have here, and again, this is a product of surface prep, this is a product of the scan software that's used, may or may not be perfectly aligned or perfectly symmetric. So we're going to take some design liberties. But as we're looking at this bracket, we can obviously see there is a reflection line that goes across. There's one at the bottom, and it sort of tapers away near the corners. Now, these details are going to be kind of tough for us to capture, but we are going to give it our best shot. So these are things that we need to look at when we get started. And for this design, I'm going to start in the forms environment, and again, we will move into surfaces. So whenever we're starting a form, the face option allows us to use object snap and snap directly to the mesh. With something like this, what I want to do is I want to make use of symmetry. I'm going to assume it's symmetric, and we're just going to get it as close as possible. So generally what I would do is I'm going to start on this one corner over here. I'm going to go over to the right-hand side. I'm going to come down, I'm going to get it relatively close to the same, and I've made my first face. I'm going to do this again. I need to find the corner, which can be tough. I'm going to come up here to this section. I'm going to come over and back down and find that corner. We're going to rotate around. And again, this can be kind of tough to do, but we're going to come up. And what I'm looking to do is everywhere there's a transition in the shadows, that's where I'm looking to place these faces. And we're going to worry about the details a little bit later, and I'm not going to worry about the top there. So I'm going to say OK. I'm going to go to my bodies folder, And in the bodies folder, notice that this thing is sort of sunken back because it's completely flat from left to right. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to move it out. Now, when we move something like this out, notice that we're wrapping over the design. It's not going to work very well. So we can try to scale it out a little bit and then move it. And that'll get us kind of close. So again, we're just sort of starting the process. We are going to push it back to that mesh at some point, but we need to start the process of getting the shape. Because I do want to make use of symmetry, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to double click on this right side. I'm going to go to Insert Edge and put an edge directly in the middle. Now, using the simple or exact is not going to matter too much at this stage in the game, but we're going to say OK. And then we're going to go to Mirror Internal for symmetry. And we're going to make that middle line a symmetry line. So again, we're going to make use of symmetry even if it's not perfectly symmetric. We're going to need more edges in order to capture this detail, but one of the critical things that we've done in the past when we have a high resolution mesh is we've created a high resolution form body so that we can pull it down to the mesh. That's not going to work in this case because we just simply don't have a smooth scan underneath it. So we're just not going to be able to do that. So the way that we want to do this is we want to manually adjust the scan. And I'm going to do that by first clicking on the middle. I'm going to hold down Shift and click that. Then I'm going to go back to Modify. I'm going to try this from the top. And I'm just going to begin pulling this back. And as I pull it back, you can see it's starting to go through the mesh. So I want to get to the point where the middle is just starting to go through the mesh. And then I'm going to take this back corner. And you can see as I'm doing this, what ends up happening is the entire thing is going behind that mesh. That's okay for right now, but we just need to be aware of where things are. We're going to pull some of that back out, but we need more resolution to do that. And then on the sides, we can take some of these vertices. I'm going to go to a left-hand view, and I can begin to pull this back. And again, what I'm looking for is starting to go through that mesh. And again, I have to mention, this is not an ideal situation to reverse engineer something. This is simply what we're doing because of the resolution of the scan. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that down. I'm going to find the next edge, double click on it, and I'm going to bring it forward a little bit. And then you can see that we really don't have any additional edges in here, so we're going to have to deal with that. So again, this is just a starting point. This is also a good time to take a look at this and note that we 100% do not have a symmetric mesh, which could mean that the mesh or the part itself is not symmetric, but more likely is that it's not perfectly aligned to the coordinate system. There are some things that we could do, but it's going to take a lot of time, and generally mesh software ends up doing this much better than a manual approach. Also note that the bottom edge that I have right now is stopping at that transition or that shadow line. And that's what I want because right now I don't want to worry about what's happening on the bottom because it blends away in this corner. That's going to be a little bit tricky for us to get. So I want to just start getting the rough shape approximately right. We're relatively close, but I need some more edges. So I'm going to double click here, go to Modify and Insert an Edge. It's going to be minus 0.5. I'm going to put it directly in the middle up here. Again, simple is going to allow it to insert the edge and change the shape. If we're happy with the shape, we can use the exact option. There are limitations. Exact is not going to let you push it really close to one of these edges. And oftentimes it might subdivide it more than you want. But in this case, it'll work fine directly in the middle. And we can double click on that edge as soon as we can find it. And then we can use Modify, Edit Form, and just bring it out a little bit. So as we're doing this, you can start to see what we want is we want each place that there is a transition where we can see the shadow and light change. That's where we want this to slightly come through our mesh. So here, I'm going to pull this out and down a little bit, and you can kind of see that transition right there. I do think it's important that we note that, again, we need to just be mindful of what we're working with in terms of the scan. Now, the scan data itself is going to have a drastic difference on the overall quality. So we don't want to get into a situation where we start pulling all these vertices down to the scan and then we end up with a bunch of wrinkles in our shape. If we're recreating this part, the fact that the shape is a little bit different generally isn't going to be a problem. We just simply need to make sure things like the mounting points are right. So this is the general process that you would go through to manually try to recreate this. Once we're happy with the shape, then we can start to extrude some more of it. So up top, I can hold down Alt and begin pulling this back. And I'm going to pull it all the way through and maybe pull it up just a little bit. And again, what I'm looking for is just a very gradual mesh coming through that solid, or that surface in this case. And once we're happy with that, then I'm going to go ahead and take this right edge, again holding down Alt, I'm going to extrude it out. And then what we need to do is go to the top view and start to pull it back, because we're looking at maintaining that curvature. So as we look at this, you can see it's a very gradual thing. There are some areas that are peeking through. You could spend a lot of time trying to get this right, but again, what we're really more interested in is getting the general shape right. Now, this section here is going to be a little tricky. I'm going to double click on this bottom edge. I'm going to go to a left view in my case, because this mesh is upside down, and we're going to begin to extrude it down. Now, in this case, because there is a harder transition, I'm going to extrude it a little bit. I'm going to let go of Alt, and then I'm going to do it again to make sort of a second iteration in there, a second edge. And then I want to manipulate this edge a little bit. I'm going to pull it forward. And again, what I'm looking for is that very gradual transition. Now, one thing you'll note is that it looks like it might be going in and then back out. So I might want to pull this forward just a little bit, and maybe this bottom edge forward just a little bit. And we're not quite done here, but a good thing that we can do in the forms is go to Inspect and take a look at the curvature map analysis. We're going to use the principal maximum. And what we're looking to see here is we want these red edges, which are going to be the radius of curvature. We want to see those in the area that we expect there to be a transition. So that looks pretty good, but the transition here is missing. So if we hide the body, there was another transition that happened right here. So this tells me that I want to insert another edge. So I'm going to select this. I'm going to go to Insert Edge. I'm going to do positive 0.5, and I'm going to use exact. And then I'm going to take this right here from the side, and we're going to manipulate this a little bit. So as we manipulate it, we can see things changing. If you want to tighten these up, we can always use Slide Edge as well. So if we use Slide Edge, we can pull that edge down a little bit. And you can see that it's starting to pull it in. Now, if this happens, then what we end up needing to do is insert another edge. This time, I'm going to insert the edge, but this time I'm going to use Simple. I'm going to pull it a little bit closer because I want that transition. You can see how it starts to affect things. It's always a good idea to check out box display. And with box display, I'm going to take both of these edges and pull them forward just slightly, just to give it a little bit more curvature. Go back to our smooth display. And then I'm going to go back to my analysis, and I'm going to increase the maximum limit and just see if I get that second red line. So it's not perfect, but we are getting relatively close to what we expect to see. So I'm okay with these results. Again, you can spend a lot of time trying to get things perfect, but in general, we just want to get the rough idea of the design correct. And it's always a good idea, if you have too many edges, to delete some of them if it's not adding to the design. Now, in this case, if we want that harder transition on the back side, then we need to do a little bit more work. But again, it's just kind of a general shape thing. Another thing you'll notice is back here, it looks like the mesh is sort of rounding away. And you can see that it's in the middle, it's sort of rounding away where it's a little bit more bulked out here. If you want to get that shape, then it's a good idea to add some additional edges and pull that back. I'm not going to go to that level again because I don't think that it's worth the time to just show you how to do it, but you can insert edges and you can continue to add to that. Now that we have a surface, I'm going to finish and then I'm going to start to trim this away. The way that I want to trim this away is I'm going to start with some sketches. So first we're going to create a sketch here. I'm going to flip this around. It's upside down, but that's okay. And I want to try to get this thing mirrored. So when we take a look at our original body, there's no coordinate system. There's no origin directly in the center, but we can create a vertical line that is roughly in the center of this. I'm going to hit escape. And once I'm happy with where the center location is, I'm going to hit X to turn it into construction, and I'm going to lock it in place. The length of the line can still change, but it's not going to move left and right. Now that I have that set, I'm going to use my line tool, and I'm going to come out and to the right. This looks to be fairly horizontal until here. And then I'm going to pick it up again up here. And I'm just going to carry this line all the way outside. I know that extends past my surfaces. Then I'm going to use a fit point spline to connect the corners. We're just going to use a tangency constraint. You can use a curvature constraint if you want. When you're dealing with straight lines, it's not going to make a ton of difference. And then we're going to adjust the weight or the influence of those. This line can push up a little bit. It can go to the right a little bit. And what we're looking to do is get it relatively close. I'm happy with that, so I'm going to mirror these to the other side. Select those three edges. My vertical mirror reference line. You can see again, it's not perfectly in line, not perfectly symmetric. It's probably rotated just a little bit, but that's okay. Then we'll bring our surface back. We'll go to our surface tools and we'll trim. So the trim tool is going to be our sketch. We want to make sure that we have everything selected, and then we're going to select the surface on the outside, and then we can hide our trim sketch. Next, we need to do the same thing from the top. So we'll bring back our faceplate mesh. We'll create a sketch from the top. And it's a good idea for us to reference the original midline. So just take one of those points and project it. So P on the keyboard, or you can go to Create, Project, Include, and Project. And now I can recreate my mirror line that's directly from that projected point. Once again, we'll turn this into construction. We can hit X on the keyboard, or you can use the sketch palette. And then we want to trim the rest of the surface. So at this point, we've trimmed it up to here. And then we need to create these little cutouts in this arc. So the arc itself, what I want to do is I want to start with a line. I'm going to make a horizontal line, make it construction, and then add an arc. So the arc here, I'm just going to bring it all the way out for now and make it tangent here. We'll hit escape, and we'll just simply bring it into where it looks about right. And then we'll use our line tool. I'm going to hold down the left mouse button to turn this into an arc at this stage, and then we're going to come back out tangent all the way out. And once we're happy with it, we'll mirror it to the other side. So line, arc, and this vertical reference here. Now that we have that, we can once again use it as a trim tool. So we'll select all of the entities that we want. You might need to hold down Control, and we'll trim the outside, and then we'll hide the sketches. So now this is the rough shape. We've got that little transition at the bottom. It didn't really blend away, but we could spend more time in forms. We've got all those top sections that look pretty good. The next thing for us to do is to turn this into a solid. So I'm going to go to Create, Thicken, and I think it's going to be about 4 millimeters. We can kind of see when it starts to come through the backside. If we make it 3, it's not quite enough. It's coming through in a few spots. Make it 3.5, gets us pretty close. So it just depends on what the final thickness of the part is. I'm going to make it 4. I'm going to say OK. So at this stage, now we could go in and we can add a lot of the back end details. We can cut out the shapes from the front. I realize I haven't saved anything yet, so let's go ahead and save this so we don't lose anything. I'm going to just call it Charger Dash. And we can handle some of those extrudes. Once again, I want that midline in there, so I'm going to start a new sketch. Again, I'm going to flip this over just because I prefer to look at it that way, and we'll just P to project that. And I can hide the original sketch. This is going to be a circle. I'm almost sure of it. It's going to be a perfect circle. We'll go ahead and pull that up a little bit. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And there's going to be another one over here that will mirror to the other side. That looks about right. And for the rest of this, what we can do is we can use a spline. And it kind of depends. In reality, this is probably an arc. This is a very gradual arc. These are probably not splines that they use to create these, but we're just going to work our way around adding some points. Again, you can add straight lines if you want. I'm just going to try to get it close. Say OK, and we'll do the same thing over here. The difference here is we're going to have to make sure that the spline at the center has a horizontal constraint on it. And the same thing down here, which we'll come back and we'll add after the fact. And again, if you're recreating this, it doesn't have to be perfect. But we're just going to select the spline, select that handle, say horizontal, do the same thing down here, just to make sure that it mirrors across just fine. Then we can mirror this spline, the circle, the spline, and pick our vertical construction line. Also, if we want to, that purple line can be construction, so it doesn't automatically select, but you can see all of the different mirrors that get added because of all the points on the spline. So if you were to do lines and arcs, you would have quite a few less, but that works okay for us. Then we just want to simply use it as a solid extrude. So hold down Control to select all these profiles. We are going to say through all, flip the direction, and now we've cut that geometry out. So before we get on to taking a look at how to do this with surfaces, let's talk a little bit about how to create some of these features on the back. So there are a couple of different ways that we can approach something like this. A few of them involve surfacing tools, a few of them involve creating some new reference planes. So I just want to kind of give you just a little bit of a tip on how you can recreate some of this geometry. So the first thing I'm going to do is I want to take a look at this little lip that's around the shape here. Now part of it is cut away, but part of it is just following that shape. So one of the ways in which we can do that is we can use some surfacing tools. In this case, we can use ruled. And what we want to do is we want to select the edges, and I'm going to go ahead and just select all of these edges, and we can begin to pull a surface up. Now, these are drafted features, so we can taper them in. If it's got texture, it's going to be something like 3 degrees. In this case, it'll be negative. And we can decide how thick this needs to be. All right, so we know that we thicken the entire body 4 millimeters, so it's probably something smaller like 2 or 3. And we'll say OK. Now, from here, it gets a little tricky, but what we can do once again is we can create a ruled surface, and then we can bring it back down, or we can use create and thicken. Now, the thicken gets a little tricky when we're talking about thickening something that has taper on it. And you can see it's already causing a problem because of these sharp corners. If we try to use a smaller amount, sometimes it will be able to create that geometry. But oftentimes when you're dealing with plastic parts or complex shapes, you'll run into situations where these tools just don't work like you expect. So in those cases, what I do is, once again, I go to something like a ruled surface. I select that outside, and we can try to do a small, let's go ahead and set the angle to 0. We can try to do a small sort of edge, and you can see that that's not working either. Then if that doesn't work, unfortunately, you have to sort of go down your list of tools. You go to Create, Offset, you pick a face. This time we're going to turn off chain selection. You pick a face, and you offset it whatever amount you want that rib to be. In this case, I'm going to say 2 millimeters. It's just slightly shorter than that. And then what we can do is we can take that original sketch and we can offset it the thickness that we want. So we created a sketch to cut that out. We'll start a new sketch, and of course it flips it around. Let's go ahead and go to the back, and we'll flip it upside down once more. So what we want to do is we want to project some of these edges and offset them. So once again, P on the keyboard. I'm going to go ahead and take all of these. I'm going to hide the sketch, the original sketch, and we're going to try to offset them. So this isn't going to work perfectly because these are 3 separate sections, but I'm going to offset it 2 millimeters. We're going to right click and repeat that on the other side. This time I'll say -2, it's going the other direction for some reason, and we'll go here, and we'll say 2 millimeters. So now what we want to do is we want to trim these. So I'm going to come in here and trim away that inside section, trim away. Don't worry about the warnings, they're just telling us that some of the constraints have been removed because of the offset. And in this case, it's honestly fine. we're not worried about these complex shapes. If you take a lot of time to really define these curves, especially if you use straight lines instead of a bunch of splines, it would be much easier. Now that we have that, we can use it as a trim tool. So we'll select this and we'll trim away the outside of our offset surface. So what this ends up doing, this leaves us this little offset surface that we can use as a trim tool. So this is our trim tool, and we want to get rid of this upper lip piece. And then we can sort of build out these features. Now, you could also do this as a solid extrude. So you can extrude up to an object, and that's perfect if you're not dealing with draft. But when you bring draft into the equation, oftentimes you run into these issues where you really need to spend time working with these different tools and techniques. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to bring that down normal, because remember we had 3 degrees draft. That's going to have a little bit of draft on the outside. And then I want to create one more offset of this inside face. This time it's going to be 0 millimeters. We'll hide the solid body, and once again, we'll use trim. So I'll use this outside surface to trim away that bottom piece, and then we'll repeat that. We'll use this bottom piece to trim away this outside surface, and this should leave us with 4 surfaces that when stitched together will allow us to create a solid body. So let's select all 4 of them, and if there's a red line here, that means that either one of the surfaces wasn't selected, or we don't actually have a closed profile. So sometimes you might want to increase the tolerance a little bit and see if you can actually get it to seal. You can see there we went up to 2.26 and it's sealed. I'm just going to say okay. And now I've got that solid body. And that solid body will allow us to join those together. You can see there's like this weird remnant here. Let's go ahead and unstitch that last one. And it looks like these should all create a solid body. I'm going to try to stitch it one more time. Say okay. All right, that looks a little bit better. I must have just missed a selection before. And once we have all of those, then we can use something like combine to put them together and create one solid body. So that's a little lip on the back side. It's kind of a pain, and I'm 100% certain that Dodge didn't do that when they originally designed the part. They obviously would have built this out of surfaces originally. But that's one way that we can sort of use surfacing tools to build those features. This offset isn't needed anymore, so I'm going to right-click and remove it. Another thing that you might need to do is reference some of these details that are on the model already. And one of the ways we can do this is going to construct and to create a plane through 3 points. Now, when we have screw bosses, generally with parts like this, they'll be at the same height. So you want to make sure that you have some sort of reference at that height. So you can see this one here is going to definitely be at the same height as this one here. And some of the other ones could potentially be at the same height. But what I do is I try to find the best scan data. So for example, I'll pick a point here, and you'll notice it's not letting me pick any points. Sometimes you have to go to your selection tools and see if there's an option to turn on points. When you're working with history turned on, oftentimes you won't actually be able to select some of those vertices, and you might actually need to go back and use the direct modeling to do that. So for some reason that does become problematic, but we can work around that. So I'm going to go into my mesh tools. I'm going to go into direct edit. I'm going to select my mesh body, and this should open up some of my selections. So now if I go to construct and plane through 3 points, I can now select those points. So I'm going to pick 2 points on this boss. I'm going to come over here and pick 1 point on this boss, and that builds that plane for me. So once I'm done building those planes, I can finish direct editing, and that plane will stay in the construction folder, and then I can use it to create a sketch. Now, Fusion 360 will automatically try to fit geometry to those if we were to use it as a mesh section sketch. If you have dimensions, if you know exactly where these are, then you can pick that. I'm going to go ahead and do a center point rectangle right at the center. So if you have that geometry, I'm not going to spend the time to dimension everything here, but if you know what that is, then you can certainly use it. And then what we would do from our solid tools is say extrude, and we're going to say to object. And if we need to draft it outwards, we can give it a draft amount, in this case 3 degrees, and we can join it. And that's the same thing for adding the ribs and adding the other geometry, because then it just builds it all as one solid part. And remember, with history, we can always go back and suppress or move it to a new location. And that's generally how you would build some of those features. Some of these other features, like the ribs, you can use the create tools to create a rib from a single sketch. You will need to create a sketch plane in order to do that, but oftentimes that's a little bit easier. Okay, so now that we've taken a look at some of that, let's do a quick save. And let's talk about how we can do this with surface tools. So we're going to hide the solid body, we're going to bring back this mesh, and we're going to try to figure out how we can recreate this shape. So in order to do this, we're going to go to our mesh tools and we're going to create mesh section sketches. We'll select the mesh body, and by default, it's going to create one right in the middle. So this first one, I'm not going to change it. I'm just going to say OK. And one of the things that can get you in trouble with a design like this is trying to build out a lot of these section sketches. And unless you have extremely high resolution on your mesh, it's only going to cause you problems. So what we want to do is we want to just put one right in the middle, and then we're going to put a couple going out to the sides. In this case, a couple, I mean 2. So I'm going to do this again, select the body, but we want to select a different plane. I'm going to select this horizontal plane. And what I want to do is I want to put one where I've got nice geometry. So if I view this from the front, I want to put it probably in the middle of this face where I know that I've got nice clean scan data. And I'm going to repeat that process, right click, and again we're going to select the same plane. This time I want to bring one a bit lower. So we're going to do a sweep, and the sweep is going to be using, in this case it's going to be using a path, and it's going to have a guide curve. And again, I'm going to put this one just above that sort of shadow line, and I'm going to say OK. Now, when we have these, this is not the end-all situation, because now we've got these 3 sketches, and underneath them, each of them have a mesh section. So in order to really work with these, what we need to do is we need to start by editing the sketch. And again, it flips it around because it's upside down. I'm just going to go ahead and flip this back. And then under our Create menu, we have something called Fit Curves to Mesh Section. Now, if you have a really high resolution mesh, that works really well. So for example, if we want to fit a spline to this, we can pick our start point and our end point, and then say OK. And then if I hide the mesh section, I'm left with a spline. But because of the mesh resolution, if I turn on curvature combs, it looks something like this. Now this is not a good result. If you followed any of my videos on creating splines from like the original Forms Mastery, this is not a good result. So with that in mind, what I would do in a case like this is I would manually create my splines. So I'm going to start back here somewhere. I'm going to come forward, and anytime we have a transition like this, I'm going to put a point at the start and the end. I'm going to come down to this curve, and I'm going to put one here. Now the trick to this is that we want to make smooth geometry, but it also needs to come all the way down to here. So I'm going to do this in 2 splines. So I'm going to do one here and sort of put it there, and just play around with getting these relatively close to our mesh section, but keeping in mind that we're recreating a part, and we want to make sure that we have nice clean input geometry. So I'm actually going to move some of these around, and actually for right now I'm going to select and delete that point and just play around with where these points are, because ultimately what I want to do is I want to connect them. We can use the handles. So for example, I can grab this handle and I can start changing its angle. It's likely going to cause you more grief than it's worth, but you have to play around with how you're comfortable creating this curvature. I do need to insert another point, so I'm going to right click, insert a fit point somewhere around here, and then move it into place. So not perfect because we need more resolution, so I'm going to add one more. Let's go ahead and right click and insert another point here and pull it up. So it gets me pretty close. I can manipulate this one up here, and then we need to connect them. So I'm going to go from here to here, and this gets a little tricky. I'm going to add a tangency, and I'll do the same thing down here. And it looks like it gets pretty close to that center section, so that looks okay. So now in the sketch, I can hide the mesh section, and what I'm left with is that spline, which is relatively clean. The next thing that we want to do is we want to create our sweep curve. Now remember, we're looking at this from a symmetric standpoint, so we're assuming that this is the midline and we're only going to build half of it. So we're going to edit sketch 7. And the important thing here is that we need to make sure that we intersect with this curve. So when I start with a fit point spline, it doesn't snap to it, but I'm going to go ahead and just get it close. And I'm going to come out to the edge here and say okay. I then need to make sure that this handle is horizontal, so when we mirror it, it'll be okay. And then I need to take something from there and project it, and then I can snap to it. That projected curve is going to be construction, so if I rotate this around, that purple curve, we're just going to make construction. So that gets us pretty close. Once again, we can expand the sketch and we can hide the mesh section, and then we can edit the last one. And you can see that if you happen to do this a bunch of times, it would get pretty tough. The other thing that we should be mindful of is up here I projected that, but that's not actually the best solution. So you can see that we're not actually hitting that edge. One thing that you can do is you can go to Create, Project, Include, and Intersect, and you can figure out where this curve, whichever curve is closest, is intersecting that sketch, and then it'll give us a point to deal with. So we need to go back and fix that other one. But again, we're going to start with a spline. I'm going to come out to the left. I want to make sure that I'm not completely horizontal here, so I'm going to hold down Control to override the persistent constraint. And I'm going to come to here and say okay. Horizontal construction here, and then just sort of manipulate the points until I get the shape that I want. Not the best way to build a complex surface, but if you're trying to replicate something you already have, then oftentimes you're going to have to just play around with the geometry. I'm okay with that. I'm going to finish the sketch. I'm going to hide that mesh section. I'm going to go back to sketch 7 and just fix this to make sure that we do have that intersection point. So once again, Create, Project, Include, Intersect. This time I'm going to select this, say okay. I'm going to delete the horizontal line, and I'm just going to make sure that the end point of my spline is coincident with that intersection point. So at this point, we now have 3 sketches. We've got our midline, we've got a guide, and we've got the rail. So we're going to go to Surfaces. We're going to do a sweep. This is going to be our profile. We're going to set this to Path plus Guide Rail. So our path can be the bottom, and the guide rail can be the top one. And you can see that it doesn't go all the way. It doesn't go all the way to the end because these curves don't go to the same location. If we bring our mesh body back, you can see that there's more here that we need to get to. So one way that we can get around that is by extending these curves out. But for right now, I'm just going to say okay. And then this upper section, what I can do is I can edit this. I can bring back my mesh section, and I can just extend this out. There's no problem with extending it out because we can trim it back after the fact. And what that allows us to do is it allows the sweep to extend. There will be a point where there'll start to be problems, so you can see there's a problem there. But that does extend it out enough so that we can start to trim it. You can see that with this method, it's a little bit trickier to get that underlying shape to match unless we really spend some time and figure out where the best places for those mesh curves are. Probably a good idea to put a mesh curve here instead of one up top. We could do this in multiple surfaces, but ultimately what you end up with is you take this, let's go ahead and do body. Take that body, you mirror it. We don't have a mirror plane, so we would need to create one. But but then we would just simply build it like we did the other version, the solid body version. With something like this, with a design like this, I don't really know that I have a preference as to which one is the better option. I think the forms will give you more control directly over the mesh. You can push and pull things, you can get it as close as you want. The surfacing technique will likely give you a better end result in terms of the quality of the surface, but it's going to be harder. You can see that the edges, the creases are cleaner than this solid body. You can see that the edges are a little bit cleaner. They might be easier to control, but ultimately it's going to be a little bit more work to do those mesh section sketches and get all the different pieces of the puzzle correct. Again, I don't really want to go through the process of completely reverse engineering everything here because there's a lot of time that goes into that. But I think for the most part, the techniques that we've covered will let you figure out the resolution of the mesh that you're dealing with, how good of a quality the mesh is, and which direction you want to go. If you have a really high quality mesh, then in the forms, you can use the pull tool to get you just to pull vertices down to it and match it. So if you have, like we've done in the past, a high quality scan of a deck lid or a trunk for a car, then you can pull points down so that your end result fits it. In this case, we're not really trying to fit to the stock shape. The main things are the mounting points being in the right location. So once you get the mounting points in the right location, then the shape, as long as it roughly matches the opening and the curvature of where it's going, in this case the center console of the dash, then it'll be fine. The end result will be fine. But it does take a lot of time to set these things up and to work through them. So at this point, if you have any questions, please let me know. If you like seeing stuff like this and you have a scan of something you want me to take a look at, please feel free to leave a comment. You can send me an email, support@cadeducator.com. And as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.